Let me ask you something. When you think about the 2008 financial crash, what do you actually remember? Maybe the news coverage, the banks, the bailouts, the word recession being repeated so many times it started to lose its meaning. And then, at some point, you probably remember hearing that things recovered. The stock market came back. Housing prices went back up. The economy, they said, had healed. And for a lot of America, that is true. But here is the part of the story that never made the follow-up headlines. Some American cities never got that phone call. While coastal metros were counting their recovery, entire communities across this country were still standing in the rubble, watching the rest of the nation move on without them. This video is about those places, and more importantly, it is about why their story matters even more in February 2026 than it did in 2009, because the threats facing these cities are not shrinking. Right now, in early 2026, they are growing. Before we get into the cities, a quick reset on what 2008 actually did at street level, because a lot of people remember it as a financial event, a Wall Street problem, numbers on a screen, but for millions of ordinary Americans, it was much more personal. It was the house they had saved for their entire adult life, suddenly worth less than what they owed on it. It was the factory job that disappeared and never came back. It was watching a neighborhood that had finally felt like it was going somewhere fill up with foreclosure signs and empty storefronts almost overnight. The 2008 global financial crash triggered a wave of foreclosures, new corporate landlords, and a housing crisis that pushed low-income owners and renters into increasingly precarious situations, effects that continued to ripple through American cities for years. Nature, and here is the thing about that ripple. In a city with a diversified economy, tech, finance, universities, hospitals, those ripples eventually settle. But in a city that was already vulnerable, already dependent on one industry, already losing population, already dealing with decades of disinvestment, the ripple did not settle. It became the water the city was drowning in. Now in 2026, there is a new layer on top of all of that. Following the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act signed into law in July 2025, local communities are grappling with major federal rollbacks to Medicaid and food assistance. The cuts are rippling through local communities, threatening access to care and straining local budgets, and federal cuts combined with trade and immigration policies have pushed local finances over the edge in cities across the country. ITEP. The cities that never fully recovered from 2008 are now facing this on top of everything else. Let us get into them. Detroit is the most famous name on this list. And in 2026, its story has a twist most people have not heard, because Detroit, against every expectation, is actually growing again. The US Census report released in May 2025 put Detroit's population at 645,705, a gain of 12,487 from the prior year's estimate. Detroit had grown for the second consecutive year, leading population gains in the state of Michigan. City of Detroit, that is genuinely significant. Detroit had been losing residents for nearly 70 years straight. In 2025, downtown Detroit recorded nearly 31 million visits and 8.7 million unique visitors. New businesses opened, General Motors announced its move into the newly completed Hudson's Detroit building, and real estate development continued to accelerate heading into 2026. Downtown Detroit? So has Detroit recovered? Not quite, and this is important. Detroit's 2026 population estimate is around 649,000, with a median household income of just under 40,000 and a poverty rate of nearly 33%. World Population Review: 1 in 3 Detroit residents lives in poverty. Downtown is genuinely thriving. New investment, new residents, visible momentum. But step outside the downtown core and the picture is different. Tens of thousands of abandoned properties remain. Entire neighborhoods that the recovery has not reached. Detroit's ability to reverse a generational trend is unusual. And while population growth doesn't solve the city's deep disparities by itself, it shifts what becomes possible. But serious questions remain. Who benefits from redevelopment? And what protections exist for long-time residents as investment accelerates? The Michigan Chronicle Detroit is not a failure story anymore, but it is not a clean success story either. It is something more complicated than either of those, and it deserves to be talked about honestly. If Detroit is the complicated one, Flint is the heartbreaking one. Flint had already been struggling long before 2008. The collapse of the auto industry had been gutting the city for decades, but the financial crash deepened every existing wound. Population fell further, the tax base shrank, city services deteriorated, and in 2014, in what became one of the most shocking failures of government in modern American history, cost-cutting decisions led to Flint's water supply being switched to a source that leached lead directly into the pipes and into the drinking water of tens of thousands of residents. The Flint water crisis ran from 2014 to 2025. On July 1st, 2025, the last lead pipe was finally replaced. 11 years after the crisis began, Wikipedia, 11 years in the United States in the 21st century. Flint's population has plummeted from about 200,000 in the 1960s to approximately 80,000 today. The city represents a microcosm of the broader issues facing post-industrial American cities, where economic collapse, infrastructure failure, and social challenges compound one another. UMA technology. And now, in early 2026, Flint faces an additional threat shared by many of the cities in this video. Federal Medicaid cuts, passed in July 2025, are beginning to phase in. In a city where a third of residents live in poverty, where healthcare infrastructure is already fragile, those cuts are not abstract policy debates, they land on real people. What happened in Flint was not bad luck. It was the direct consequence of a city without the political power to make anyone move fast enough. That dynamic has not changed. Most people outside the Midwest have never been to Gary, Indiana. Some people have never heard of it. But Gary's story is one of the starkest illustrations on this list of what happens when a city's entire identity is built around a single industry. And that industry leaves. Gary was built by U.S. Steel in 1906, literally constructed for the purpose of making steel. At its peak, it was a prosperous, thriving city of 170,000 people. Then the steel industry contracted, and Gary contracted with it. Gary has borne the brunt of deindustrialization, with the population declining by over 50% since its peak in the 1960s. Urban blight has become widespread. Crime and unemployment remain significantly higher than national averages, and a lack of investment in community resources has hindered economic recovery. Progress is slow, with many areas still struggling with abandoned properties and economic stagnation. The finance key. Gary today sits just 30 miles from downtown Chicago, one of the most economically dynamic cities in America. The contrast between what Gary is and what is visible on the horizon captures something true about how economic recovery in America actually works. It does not spread evenly, it concentrates, and Gary, for 50 years now, has been on the wrong side of that concentration. Youngstown, Ohio has a specific date burned into its collective identity, September 19, 1977, Black Monday. The day Youngstown Sheet and Tube closed its Campbell Works plant, the closure marked the beginning of a massive job loss. 50,000 jobs disappeared within 5 years. Youngstown's population has declined from over 150,000 in the mid-20th century to below 65,000 today. Nearly 40% of residents live below the poverty line, and some neighborhoods have abandoned properties that outnumber occupied homes. The finance key: abandoned properties outnumbering occupied ones. There are streets in Youngstown where you are more likely to see an empty house than a family living inside one. And yet people are there, raising children, building something, refusing to give up on a place that the national conversation gave up on decades ago. The 2008 crash did not start Youngstown's problems, but it confirmed definitively, Ed, that the recovery was not coming. Home values that had held on through decades of industrial decline collapsed. Residents who had stayed through everything watched what little they had built evaporate. Now, in 2026, proposed federal cuts to community development block grants, the funding that cities like Youngstown use for housing rehabilitation and neighborhood services, threaten to remove one of the last tools these communities have to fight back. Deep cuts proposed to community development block grants and home investment partnerships programs are hitting smaller and under-resourced communities hardest, the places that can least afford to lose that support. Smart Growth America. Stockton surprises people on this list because California, because sunshine, because surely California recovered. Stockton's story is about proximity and inequality in one of the most striking forms you will find anywhere in America. The city sits about 80 miles east of San Francisco. Those two cities might as well be on different planets. Home values doubled in some San Francisco and Silicon Valley zip codes over the past decade. But in the hardest hit Stockton zip codes, homes over that same period lost 20% of their value. The national housing market broadly recovered from the crash, but in Stockton that recovery never fully arrived. The Washington Post Stockton became the largest American city to file for municipal bankruptcy when it did so in 2012. It survived, it emerged. But emerging from bankruptcy and genuinely thriving are two very different things. Nearly a decade after launching an economic stimulus program that waived over $94 million in public facility fees to spur post-recession development, Stockton City Council in 2025 was still grappling with mounting budget challenges and growing infrastructure concerns. Stocktonia. And now in 2026, the federal funding environment has become actively hostile to cities in California. Federal grant applications are being scrutinized under new executive order requirements. Competitive grants for housing and public safety face delays or outright denials. Stockton in 2026 is a city that spent 15 years clawing its way back from the financial crisis and is now doing so against a new headwind. The Altamont Pass, the mountain ridge between Stockton and the Bay Area, is just geography, but it might as well be a wall. Camden sits across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. On a clear day, you can see the Philadelphia skyline, gleaming new developments, a thriving waterfront, visible investment. Camden has a different story. Camden, once a powerhouse of industry, has fallen hard from its heights. Plagued by high crime rates and deep poverty, it has become one of the most economically distressed cities in the United States. We three travel Camden's problems long predate 2008. But the crash removed whatever fragile economic footing the city had managed to maintain. Property values that were already low cratered. Residents who could leave did. Those who stayed were in a city simultaneously losing tax revenue and facing increasing demand on its public services. Camden at one point dissolved its entire police force in a budget crisis, a moment that became a national symbol of just how completely a city can be hollowed out. And Camden is 10 minutes from Philadelphia. That geographical detail never stops being jarring, because it tells you something honest about how recovery works in America. It is not about distance. It is about which side of an invisible line you happen to be on. Here is what is different about telling this story in February 2026 versus 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the argument was that these cities had been left behind by the recovery. Today, the argument is darker. The safety nets that helped these communities survive, federal housing grants, Medicaid expansion, food assistance, community development funding, are being actively cut. In just a 5-month span from December 2024 to April 2025, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Washington all experienced credit rating downgrades. At least 20 of the nation's 25 most populous cities reported budget gaps for fiscal year 2026. Governing if cities with thriving downtowns and diversified economies are struggling with budget gaps right now. Think about what this environment means for Gary, for Youngstown, for Flint, for Camden. Even large cities including Chicago, Houston, and San Francisco are under serious financial stress in early 2026, driven by declining downtown activity, loss of federal funds, and mounting pension commitments. The conversation. The cities that never recovered from 2008 do not have rainy day funds to draw on. They do not have diversified revenue streams. They have been running on the fiscal equivalent of fumes for 15 years, and the federal government just turned off the last petrol station on the road. Before we close, I want to say something the data does not capture. These are not abandoned places. Every single city on this list has people in it who love it. People who remember what it was, people who are fighting for what it could still become. Flint residents who organized for years, held government accountable, and finally got those last lead pipes replaced in July 2025. Youngstown community organizations turning vacant lots into urban gardens and youth programs. Detroit artists, entrepreneurs, and young families moving into renovated houses in neighborhoods the national narrative had written off, and proving that narrative wrong. Gary residents who have been saying for decades that their city deserves more than it gets and who are still saying it. Stockton families who stayed through the bankruptcy, through the budget cuts, through the years of uncertainty, and are still building a life there. Camden neighbors who know each other's names and look after one another in ways that never make the evening news. The story of these cities is not only decline, it is also stubborn, unglamorous, largely unacknowledged resilience. Detroit just proved that a city written off for 70 years can turn around. That matters. The 2008 crash did not create the problems facing the cities in this video, but it exposed them. It revealed which communities had enough cushion to absorb a shock and which did not. It showed which cities had diversified economies and which had bet everything on one industry that was already leaving. And when the recovery came, slow, uneven, concentrated in the cities that were already winning, these communities were largely left to figure it out on their own. 17 years later, many of them are still figuring it out. And in February 2026, the political environment is not making that any easier. That is not a story about failure. It is a story about who America decides to invest in and who it keeps deciding to leave behind. If this video made you think differently about even one of these places, subscribe. This channel is built for exactly this kind of content. Not travel brochures, not highlights reels, real stories about real places. The ones that do not make the glossy magazine covers. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what we cover next. And if you grew up in one of these cities, or you live there right now, drop a comment. Tell us what the data does not show. Because the people who are actually there know things that no statistic will ever capture. And this channel genuinely wants to hear it.